So the time has come to look at this real challenge in the piano repertoire. It's a Patreon request by N. Ladas, and it's some of the most painting piano writing there is about this water spirit or siren Ondine singing to seduce a young man. Now, there's a lot to be said about this music. It's the first movement of a set of 3 pieces in Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, followed by the haunting Le Gibet, the gallows, and the notorious and frightening Scarbo. And this is all music set from poems. There's a collection of 53 short poems by Aloysius Bertrands that has the same name, Gaspard de la Nuit. And apparently Ravel was very fond of this, and he chose these 3 to set to music. First of all, Gaspard was the title of something like a royal treasurer in old times. And Gaspard is actually a character in this volume. He appears in the preface as someone who meets the author and hands over the manuscript to the volume. It's very meta poetry. And there's a lot more to be said about this, connections with literary references and the poems and Ravel. But I would just recommend a book if you want to dive deeper into this. Reflections by Paul Roberts. He's a great pianist and professor at Guildhall, and I had the honor of playing masterclasses for him, playing this Ravel music actually. So there's one chapter on each major work of piano music by Ravel. So the chapter on Gaspard is great. He goes through all the history and the details of these connections. Now, Ondine is probably the easiest to comprehend of the 3. And let's just look at the first paragraph of the poem. By the way, the poems are printed in the edition, or they should be, because Ravel very much thought them to be connected with the music. Listen, listen, it is I, it is Ondine who brushes with these drops of water the vibrant panes of your window, lit by the gloomy rays of the moon. And here in gown of watered silk, the lady of the castle gazes from her balcony on the beautiful starry night and the beautiful sleeping lake. So that's setting the scene. Ondine then goes on to try to seduce this young man inside the house from outside the window. She wants him to follow her to the palace underwater to become king of the lakes. And normally, if you're a young man and a girl is flirting with you, that's a good thing. But in this case, it's not a good idea, because he would drown. And in the end, he resists the temptation and Ondine leaves him alone. And I will just read one sentence about how this type of poetry works from Reflections by Roberts. Le Gibet, the gallows, and Scarbo work similarly as Ondine, drawing the reader into an intensity of imagined listening and seeing. Sound and sight, hearing and seeing seem to fuse. And the clearest example in Ondine is towards the end, as Ondine, shedding a tear as she fails to lure her lover to a watery grave, suddenly bursts into laughter, a sound which, as she vanishes, becomes transformed into a shower of spring rain splashing against the windows. Now, when we turn to the music, we'll see how Ravel translates this wonderful poetic language into his own beautiful music in a masterly fashion. So let's start by identifying the thematic material. And there's actually 5 motifs or kind of material building blocks that interacts in a very complex way throughout the piece. And almost every bar is inhabited by one of these. So 3 of them are kind of siren song motifs. I would call them type A, type B, and type C. And the first one is, of course, the type A. So it's all the time interacting with texture, the water shimmering in the right hand, but I'll get to that later. Type B comes on page 2. It's higher up and it's like this. And all of these 3 types, they kind of share the same contour. It's going down a fifth and then back up. So it's a fifth down and back up, and this one, it goes to another note higher. And then type C comes a little bit later. It goes like this. So it has this whole tone feeling that's a little bit more exotic, if you want. And also type B and type C, they end in the same way. So when we go down, this type of figuration is the same in type B. This happened to be the same key as well, but they start in different ways. And then there's another important building block that I would call the closing part, because it's kind of closing the music one time early, and then it comes back and closing the music late in the piece as well. And it's going downward for a bit longer time, and it has these quarter note triplets. So up here, and so on, it goes down. And then we have the fifth motif a little bit later in the piece, and it's a complete contrast because it comes in the low register and is pointing upward. It comes the first time like this. So I'm going to go ahead and call this the Gaspard motif. And I don't mean it like the character, the actual character in the poems, but more like in spirit, because it's something that goes through the whole set in the other two movements as well. There's something not right under the surface, something devious and cunning, and it shows in Ondine in this motif. And it will play an important part in the piece, as we will see. Okay, so that's our 5 motifs and building blocks. Now let's see how they are put together. So in the beginning we get the siren song, type A and type B. Then there's a little bit of an episode with a little bit of new texture, but then we get the closing part. And then there is a moment where it feels like it's starting over again. We go back to only the texture. And we get one bar of only this, which feels like the beginning. And then we get the siren song, and now it's type C, the whole tone. And this is like a short section, the energy grows a little bit more, and then we get another start again with only the texture. So I think these are like salient moments that you can put a structure on. So now the third time it starts over, we get type A. Now this is much longer part. Basically the rest of the piece follows from here with no stops and new starts. And here we get the entry of the Gaspard motif, and it's like a dialogue between first the type A and the Gaspard motif, and then we get type C with new texture, and it's like a fight with the Gaspard motif. It starts growing more and more, and the climax is a variant of the type C. We'll get to there. Then we get a return of the closing part with more extended scales all the way as glissando. That's a nice scale. And then a final return of the type A, but this time it's in minor. All the other times it's kind of major, but it's now minor. And then we get the final, finally the music stops towards the end and it gets silent, and we have only a melody, and it's the B type that we only had one time before, early in the beginning. Now we get it without the texture. It should be much slower, of course, when we get here. I'm just brushing over the form. And then after that is just the final coda, basically loose arpeggios. We get the laughter from the poem. and yeah, get to that in detail later. That's basically the form of the piece. But now let's start over from the beginning and look at the texture in itself. There's so many dimensions and variables in this piece. So we have this kind of combination of a trill and a tremolo in a specific intricate rhythm. And it's just super soft, it's water shimmering, like ripples on the surface. I don't think it's too important if you drop a note or two, as long as it's very, very soft. And Paul Roberts makes a great point in the book that every time in the piece, the siren song motifs come with this texture, some kind of watering texture. And it's like Ondine is a water spirit. She is one with her element. They're all the time connected. And it's only one time in the end we hear the siren song without it, and that's a special effect when that comes. But basically Ravel finds these watering textures, and this is like the stable one. And he starts to vary it a little bit in octaves later. It's basically the same, just jumping octaves. And then we get more freer kind of waves, arpeggios and scales up and down. And you can look at the score and it looks like a wave here, for example. And one thing on the first page with this texture, in early editions, and I think like edition on IMSLP as well, it changed the texture after a while to... But that's wrong. It should be the same texture as in the beginning. There's no reason for it to change. It will only like make the pianist work much harder for no effect. And I have this on good authority. Not only is it explicit in Paul Roberts' book, Reflections, but also my second teacher I had, Thomas Rydfeldt, he took a masterclass from Vlado Perlmutter, who was a student of Ravel. And my teacher played this, and he said that Vlado said that it was wrong because he knew from having worked with this with Ravel, but somehow they made a mistake in the editions and they refused to correct it for unknown reasons. But now I have a Peter's edition that's more newer, and they have finally corrected it. So now this is how, like, you can still hear recordings with the old wrong texture. So no need to practice that, it's in vain. Okay, and now to the harmony in the beginning.